say, it's just so lovely to come and just worship together, isn't it? I have to say, while it might be a real privilege to have a husband, I am so tired today. Snoring was not good last night. So I feel slightly like I'm not really here. So I just want to apologize if things don't come out quite right. I'm just really tired. So I'm just laying that out there. Because I feel really passionate about this, and I'm really excited about this, but I don't really quite remember where I am. So I just wanted to be honest with you, and I don't know whether to go for my glasses or not. Anyway, as you all know, we are in a series looking at the names of God. We paused for our incredible 20th birthday celebrations last week, didn't we? But we are back to it, and I believe the series is going through till Easter. And I have the real privilege of talking about one of the names of God that just means so much to me personally, and that is El Roi, the God who sees. And actually, it was an Old Testament character, an Egyptian slave woman who first spoke out this name of God. So this morning, we're going to hone in on different parts of her story as we unpack what his name means. I am going to start with my glasses in case I need them. So if you could put up the first scripture, Genesis 16, 1-4, let's just read through that together. Now, Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abraham, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abraham agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abraham had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. Now, Hagar's story became entwined with Abraham's and Sarah's as soon as she became their slave. But it was their disappointment and their taking things into their own hands that meant she became intimately involved with them. Because even though they'd heard directly from God that he would make Abraham into a great nation, nothing had changed. Years went past, Sarah could still not conceive. So Abraham and Sarah decided just to move things along a bit. Have you ever done that? Had a promise from God and thought, this is just taking too long. Let me just see. Maybe he means me to do something. Maybe I'm supposed to take action. It doesn't normally go very well, does it, when we try and do that, which is quite annoying. Anyway, Sarah gives her maidservant Hagar to Abraham to conceive on her behalf. Now, this probably seems really strange to us, but it was a custom that was allowed back in those days in the land of Ur, which is where they came from. So if a wife could not conceive, she would sometimes give her servant to her husband, and any resulting children would belong to the wife. So the bloodline, so the man and woman would have that child and raise it as their own, and the bloodline would continue. And we're not told how Hagar felt about that at all, which seems strange. But actually, if we go back to verse 3, it says that she gave her to her husband to be his wife. Actually, it meant a change in standing for the better for Hagar. So quite often, if this happens, they would be seen as a concubine or a second wife. Now, as she spent time in their community, Hagar would have come to understand more about the God that Abraham and his family worshipped. They were, after all, following what God had asked them to do back in Genesis 12, to leave where they were and become nomads. It says, "Go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." So Hagar would have heard about this special covenant that God had made with Abraham. I don't know what her expectations would have been, but I kind of suspect that she would probably have thought, as a servant in a household where they were so devoted, that actually she would be better treated because of their deep faith. And actually, Hagar might have been quite close to Sarah, because it was Sarah who suggested Hagar was the one that went to Abraham. She may well have trusted her more than other servants. But I have to be honest, when I read this story, and I can see on a few of your faces as well, through modern eyes, this seems pretty shocking. It seems abusive almost to just take another human being and expect that she's just going to sleep with my husband and produce an heir for me. That just seems crazy. And actually, I think it's really important when we come across parts of the Bible where there is violence, where there are things that just seem really strange to us, to pause and think, oh, this is the reaction I'm having. Why is that? And try and unpack it a little bit. And obviously, I've just given you the background that actually was a custom that happened. And actually, when we look, it seems like Hagar, in her change of position, began to be a little bit proud and began to laud the advantage that she had over her mistress. And there are times in the passage where she starts disrespecting Sarah. In verse 4, it says, when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And the New Living Translation puts it as she began to treat her mistress with contempt. And the whole thing just becomes a real mess. The jealousy, the hurt, the disappointment all rises to the surface as the pregnancy becomes more and more evident. And we're just going to read verse 5 and 6 together. Just think about how they must each have been feeling by this point. Then Sarah said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong that I'm suffering." Just think about that. She was the person who suggested it, and now she's blaming him. "I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. So he went along with it, and now is washing his hands of all responsibility. He says, "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarah ill-treated Hagar, so she fled from her. So Hagar became desperate because of Sarah's treatment of her. And so she runs away. And she's risking her own life and the life of her unborn baby at that point because they were nomads living in the desert. Where was she going to get shelter? Where was she going to get food? Where was she going to get water? But I think that's the whole point, isn't it? When we face circumstances and situations in our life that become so difficult, we just don't think we can carry on. We can sometimes make really irrational decisions. Have you ever done that? I know that I have. And for those of you who don't know our story, I think quite a few of you do. Apologies, this will seem like a bit of a bombshell, but obviously having our 20th anniversary made me start thinking about all of this again as I was preparing this preach. Because just as the church was starting, I actually left, and I left with another man. I'd felt quite early on when I made that choice that it was the wrong choice, but I felt like there was nothing I could do. I'd been a bit like Sarah, that I took things into my own hands because for years I had cried out to God for him to change the circumstances that we found ourselves in because I never saw Steve. We had 10 years of pretty much living on our own because of the hours that he worked. So we hardly ever saw each other. And I didn't trust God to change things after 10 years and when everything was still the same. But then, once I had gone, I really wasn't sure about the choice and the action at all, because basically I missed my husband. He'd been my best friend from about the age of 12, but I didn't feel like I could voice my concerns to the person that I had put my trust in, and it actually took God getting on his case, which was a complete miracle, given where he was, for us to be able to untangle the mess that we'd got ourselves in. So what happened when Hagar was out in the wilderness? She had an encounter that changed everything. So let's read the next portion. "The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that's beside the road to Shur. And he said, 'Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from? And where are you going?' 'I'm running away from my mistress Sarah,' she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, 'Go back to your mistress and submit to her.' The angel added, 'I will increase your descendants so much they'll be too numerous to count.' The angel of the Lord also said to her, 'You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. Let's just hone in on some of the details there. Where it says the angel of the Lord came to her, many commentators believe that that's actually the pre-incarnate Christ. So just think, he called her by name. And let's take a closer look at what her name meant as well, because in the Bible we know quite often names are really important. People's names are changed because of the particular meaning of the name they're being changed to. So names, we need to take notice of people's names in the Bible. In Hebrew, Hagar means forsaken or flight, which really sums up what happened to her, doesn't it? It was because she felt forsaken that she took flight from the situation that she was in. However, because she's an Egyptian, some commentators say there may have been another meaning to the word as well, and some suggest that her name was actually Keturah, and she was given the name Hagar when she became their servant because it means stranger. Now, whichever was the reason that she had that name, she felt like an outsider at that point, didn't she? And she found her situation so intolerable, she fled. Now, after calling her by name, the angel of the Lord then asked her 2 questions. Asking her those questions gave her dignity and the chance to think about and voice what was happening to her, because he didn't need to know what was going on in her life. He knew exactly what was going on, but he asked her those questions to draw it out of her. He was also showing her that it wasn't all about Sarah and Abraham. They may have had that special covenant, but he cared for her as well, and he took the time to go to her, even though she'd fled. And then he went on to tell her the forthcoming details of her life, that she'd have a son. And this is actually the first time in the Bible of God naming a child while still in the womb, which is incredible, isn't it? And he goes on to say that her descendants will be so numerous that she wouldn't be able to count them. That's an echo of the promise that he gave Abraham. And then Hagar names God the one who sees me, or El Roi, because she's seen a glimpse of his character. The fact that he cares enough for her to notice her. But not just that, he cares enough to come and spend time with her. Just think about that for a moment. She was a foreign slave living in a culture where women were seen as property. And yet she was the one who gave God a name. And actually she was the first and only person mentioned in the Bible to give God a name. It seems like for her, this is the first time in her story that she feels known and loved. Isn't that what we are all looking for ourselves? And I think that's partly why this story is in the Bible, as a reminder to each of us that God sees us, that he is El Roi. He has made each one of us with an inbuilt desire to be seen and known. That is what causes an infant to search out his parent's face for a gaze upon them, for the attention of their parent, just so that they can feel safe. But as we grow up, too often we continue to look to the faces around us instead of God for our affirmation and for that attention. But it's only in him that we can be truly known and loved fully. And that is what God desires for us. He wants to lavish his love upon us. Because with him, there's no need to pretend. There's no need to conform to a particular way of behaving in order to be accepted. We are just free to be ourselves. So let that sink in for a moment. It is a really simple truth, but I think it's something that we can just gloss over and go, yeah, I know God loves me. No, God loves you. God sees you. God sees you as you fully are. He sees your potential. He sees the purposes that he's placed in your life. He makes time for you. He hears your voice, and he loves to do so. He gives you space to open up and talk to him about the joys in your life, but about the difficulties too. Now, it wasn't just that God swept in and rescued Hagar. He actually, if you noticed, asked her to do something really hard. Go back to your mistress and submit to her. That was probably the last thing she wanted to hear coming out of his mouth. And the details, I don't know if you noticed, about her son's future, about how everyone's hand would be against him and he would live in hostility, that's really tough to hear about your child as well. There were really difficult things that God said to her at this point, but fueled with the knowledge that he saw her and he cared for her and he'd called her out by name, Hagar did what he asked her to do, even though she had no indication that Sarah was going to treat her any better. Now, this speaks to me of the treasure that each one of us has as believers. No matter what disappointment or struggle that we face, even when God asks us to do something that we find hard, and let's be honest, he does that quite often, doesn't he? We have the security of knowing that he sees us and he loves us. And this impacts those seemingly impossible seasons. But it also impacts those times where he makes us uncomfortable because he's prompting us to repent. He sees the sin that we're in. He sees the impact of that. And he wants us to be free. So it's his love that is prompting us to repent. It's also a really helpful handhold in those times where we do feel overlooked by those around us. It's really important, that phrase, we do things for an audience of one. So we do things before our God, not for each other. That actually the important thing is not for the praise of man, it's for serving God. But let's be honest, there are times where it does feel hard when people overlook us. And so it's actually really good for us to encourage one another. But remembering that he sees us and he loves us at all times can really help in those moments. So going back to Hagar's story, we know that in Genesis 21, her and her son are sent away again. They end up back in the desert. So God hasn't taken all of those difficulties away. They did all live peacefully together for a time, but not that long after Sarah had her son, Abraham, as his name had been changed, sent Hagar and Ishmael out into the wilderness again because having them around upset his wife. So back out in the desert, I'm sure Hagar must have questioned why she'd ever trusted them in the first place and why she'd ever trusted God when he told her to go back. She must have felt bitter, mistreated, put upon. I am sure that there were all sorts of negative emotions threatening to overwhelm her at that point. And in Genesis 21, we see her in absolute despair. Her son's crying, she's put him out of eye line because she cannot bear to watch him starve to death. But at this point, in verses 15 to 16, it says, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. But the rest of this chapter describes how God still saw her. He saw her son, he saw her, he saw their physical needs, and actually he looked after them until the boy became a man. Verses 17 to 20 says, God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what's the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. Now, I don't believe that this is the life that Hagar must have imagined for herself and for her son. I imagine that having born an heir to Abraham, she must have assumed that she'd be honored or at least kept safe and looked after. But that's not what happened, is it? But God was there with them, even when they ended back up in that desert place. And sometimes the same happens to us. We might be facing circumstances that are so difficult that they threaten to overwhelm us. Perhaps we've been let down by others, maybe those in the church. But we can often blame God in those times when actually he's the only constant in the situation. He hasn't changed. And however others may treat us, he will never let us down. But that doesn't mean that he shields us from hard circumstances, including how other people might treat us. And I think sometimes when we are on the receiving end of some really difficult behavior from others, we can find that really difficult to accept. But we can take comfort and courage from knowing that Jesus was misunderstood and mistreated, but he was able to rise above all of that. How? By communing constantly with his Father and knowing his absolute love and affirmation, which is available for each one of us today too. And Jesus, when he did walk the earth as a human, also showed that he saw those around him. He often took time to call out and spend time with those that others missed, looked down upon, or even despised. There are so many examples of Jesus doing this. The one that immediately sprung to mind was Zacchaeus, the tax collector. Just because of what he did, everybody hated him. And as a short man, when he wanted to see Jesus, the only way he could do so was climb up a tree. And there are huge crowds around. What does Jesus do? He stops by that tree and he calls Zacchaeus by name and he says, "Come down, I'm coming to your house today," much to the disgruntlement of everybody else around him. But he wanted to spend time with him. When he came across blind Bartimaeus in Mark 10, the blind man shouted over and over again, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus took note of that cry and he stopped and he asked others to bring the blind man over. And then, interestingly, when we think about the questions that were asked of Hagar, he asked blind Bartimaeus a question: "What do you want me to do for you?" Now, to me, oh my goodness, Jesus, what do you mean, what do you want? He's blind. What do you think he wants you to do? But actually, again, he was giving him an opportunity for dignity. It was his choice. And it also gave him the opportunity to exercise faith. And then Jesus goes on to him and says, "Go, your faith has healed you." He saw right into the man's heart, and he knew what he needed, and he gave him the chance to vocalize it. The woman with the issue of bleeding, who had bled for 12 years straight and was an outcast in society because of that, she was so desperate for healing. We read in Luke 8 that she made her way through the crowds who still totally ignored her. She shouldn't have been there. And she touched his cloak. And immediately that she did that, she was healed. So in this instance, Jesus felt something first. He felt the power going out of him. But then the passage goes on to say, then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, walked forward and told him that it was her who'd done so. He stopped. His words drew her closer, and then he spoke tenderly to her. "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Yes, she encountered an incredible miracle of physical healing, but perhaps actually the healing that went even deeper was the one that touched her heart. After years as an outcast, she was now seen, loved, esteemed, rather than ignored. But when I was thinking about interactions with Jesus, my mind went to Mary and Martha in John 11, which I know I've preached about a few times before, but there are just a few things I want to bring out of this. So their brother Lazarus had been sick, and so they sent a message to Jesus, presumably thinking, he's our friend, he'll rush back, he'll heal him, everything will be fine. But with what happened, they must have felt ignored, because Jesus stayed where he was for a few more days, precisely because he knew Lazarus was sick. That must have really grated. And in that time, their brother died. But the truth was, Jesus was not ignoring them. And we'll see in a minute how much he cared for them. He had a bigger perspective and a bigger purpose. And again, that is something that I think we need to remember in those times where we feel that he's forgotten us. In verse 4 of John 11, he says, "This illness will not end in death. No, it's for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." And when he did arrive back and saw all the mourners, he didn't rush straight away to do the miracle. We know that he does raise Lazarus from the dead, but he gave both the sisters the time and space that they needed to express their pain. Again, he knew where they were both at, and he allowed each of them to voice the same thing. They both said exactly the same thing. "If you'd been here, my brother would not have died." The pain and the anguish that must have been in those words. So Martha's the one who says that first. And Jesus interacts really deeply with her. He draws things out of her with declarations and questions again, explaining to her that he is resurrection and life, that he does have the power over death. And she is actually able to declare, as part of that, before the miracle happens, that she believes he is the Messiah. So again, he saw her greatest need, and he met that. Then he sees Mary. She'd surrounded herself with lots of other mourners. She had purposely not gone out to meet Jesus when he got back. But a surprising thing happens. She says the same thing as her sister in verse 32. But then in the next verse, we are told that Jesus noticed her tears. It says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and what happens, it causes an emotional response in him. We're told a few verses later that Jesus wept. So he took time to respond openly himself before he took any action. He was pained by the impact of Lazarus' necessary death. This was a miracle that had to happen to show that he had the power over death itself. But he was upset by the pain that he caused his dear friends. But I think it's interesting to reflect on the fact that he trusted those friends enough to allow that to happen to them. But what we have learned about El Roi today shows that he knows us and he sees us, but also that he provides a really great model for how we should be with one another too. Jesus, both in the Old Testament as the angel of the Lord, but also in the New Testament examples that I've shared, and there's many others, each time he noticed, he stopped, and he came alongside people. He's the one who knows us inside out, and yet he doesn't assume anything. He gives us opportunity to speak ourselves. And when I picture him with Mary crying alongside her, it reminds me of when Job's friends came alongside him when he'd lost everything, and they simply tore their clothes and lamented alongside their friend. Jesus draws near to each one of us. Sometimes he simply sits with us, providing companionship and comfort. But he might also ask us some questions, such as, what do you want me to do for you? Or, where have you come from and where are you going, as he did with Hagar? Giving people time and space is so important. Too often we can rush in with quick fixes when somebody comes to us, don't we? But it actually gives other people dignity when we wait and simply listen to them. I had an experience of this recently. We were at a conference and a woman had been sharing some things that resonated with me. So I sought her out afterwards and we arranged a time to chat and pray together. And during that time, she just simply sat and listened to me. And she prompted me occasionally with questions. And then when she did begin to pray, she held my hands and she paused frequently. And then at one point, she looked me in the eyes for much longer than is actually comfortable. And then she said over and over again, I am so sorry. Things have been so hard for so long. And she was a stranger to me. All she knew were the things that I told her. It just felt like Jesus was saying those words to me. And I just broke down in healing tears. actually, I think what that shows us is sometimes we are the conduit through which God shows somebody else that he sees them. I think that's one of the reasons why we are in community together. So let's be quick to heed his prompts to reach out to one another in however big or small a way that he might suggest, even when it might be inconvenient for us. So why don't you take away that thought and question yourself at some point this week, who can I reach out to? Who is God asking me to reach out to? So with each of the biblical characters that we've looked at, the thing that changed attitudes, and sometimes, but not always, circumstances, was simply an encounter with Jesus. And that is what we should be pursuing daily, trusting that he truly does see us, and he wants us to know his empathy, his care, his love, his compassion, his power, and his restoration, even in those times where he's asking us to persevere despite huge difficulties. Remember, as it says in Hebrews 4:15, we do not have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet he did not sin. If I can invite the band to go back up. So I just want to leave you with a few questions. What is it that you need in an encounter with El Roi today? Do you simply need to sense his loving gaze upon you? Do you need to reach out to him with gratitude that he sees you? Acknowledge that he sits with you in your pain and truly is the one who can empathize? Is he asking you to be more confident in your identity in him, that you are his child, known, seen, and loved, and trust him as you step out? Is he nudging you to answer the question, what do you want from me today? Is he asking you to remain faithful in a situation that you're finding really tough? Whatever it is, know that you are not alone. El Roi is with you always. So let's draw close to him again in worship. And please allow your heart to respond in whichever way God prompts you, because he's the one who sees you and knows you best.